Hello and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with Newroll, the business podcast that brings the boardroom to you. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. I wanted to take a moment before we start to say thank you for all the support and positive feedback on the podcast. One recent comment from @YoveerGill stood out, which highlighted finding a mentor in Enter the Boardroom. If anyone listening is interested in finding a traditional, in-person mentor, do consider joining the Newroll board community, which you can find at community.newroll.com. For just £29 a month, we have created a space where you can get matched with a mentor, as well as learn, grow your board network, and tap into the hive mind of over 60,000 board members in real time. Today's guest, Sir Nicholas Coleridge, CBE, is due to take over as Eton Provost in September 2024. He is Chair of Historic Royal Palaces and former Chair of the British Fashion Council, Professional Publishers Association, Conde Nast Britain, and the Victoria and Albert Museum. Sir Nicholas spent most of his executive career with the Conde Nast Group, latterly as President of Conde Nast International. Sir Nicholas, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, very fun to be here.
You've led some incredibly illustrious institutions through some really challenging financial times. And I'd like to start with your time at Conde Nast, where you oversaw a range of different moves, which saw the company pivoting from print to digital. As you look back at that period now with the benefit of hindsight, can you just analyse for me what you see as the key moments through the eyes of a board member? And I'm really interested in what you felt you got right and where now with the benefit of hindsight you think you could have done better.
Well, the first thing to be said about Conde Nast is it is a private company. It is owned 100% lock, stock and barrel by the Newhouse family of New York. And it was their prize and is their prize possession. They own many other things too, but Conde Nast is the one that they're interested in the most. That anyway was how it always seemed to me. When I joined the company in 1989, the magazine industry was just about to take off. The period through the 70s and the 80s, you began to see an upward movement. But it was really through those period of 1990 to, let us say, 2015, where the expansion was completely remorseless. A sign of that is that when I joined the British company, it had 5 magazines. When I left, it had 11. In the international company, which was where I spent most of my time, it went from having 40 titles to having 139. The profits of the company went from, well, it's a private company, we never announced them. But in the international bit, we went from making about $30 million a year to just about $200 million a year. So you saw this huge uplift. I think it was surprising to all of us, and probably especially even to the owners, that the 2 countries that were going to become hugely important were China and Russia, and Britain and Italy, which had always been doing pretty quietly well, suddenly shot up. Margins in all of these businesses, we in the end came to think that 18% was, anything below that was a disappointment. And so the backdrop to that very, very long 30 years I spent in Conde Nast was print was growing at this colossal rate all of the time. Then came digital. We were in very, very early. Conde Nast was into digital before Facebook. Doesn't that seem extraordinary? Really, really early. But it took a long time for the luxury market to really embrace digital. And I would say that they are only about halfway there now. The margin of profit on print was so high. It was so high that if you wanted to take a double-page advertisement at the front of Vogue, it cost you $27,500. And if you said, I would prefer to pay a little bit less, The answer would come not in that position. If you want to be the 10th spread, that's what you pay. If you want a cheaper page, you can go much later in the book, and people didn't want to. So digital started as a kind of exciting, rather exotic, slightly clunky, because you may remember those early days of practically having to dial in, and you still had to type W dot before you could type anything else. And it was difficult even to get good digital staff at the beginning because there were none. No one could be taken from anywhere else because no one had any digital expertise. You asked me what I think was good and what I think was bad. I think on the good side, it was good for Conde Nast to be in early, and it kind of grew at roughly the same speed as the readership and as the usership came along. If you look at the early days of Vogue Digital, it was a rare week. People thought it was great if 50,000 unique users came to the site. Now it would be considered a disaster if 1 million didn't. So in these very early days, it's difficult to know whether it would have been better to spend even more. In a curious way, what's happened, particularly in the last 5 years, and I retired from day-to-day working there around that amount of time ago, there's been more and more investment in digital. But the great challenge of it is the yield impression, the price that Chanel, that Dior, LVMH generally, the Gucci group, Kering as they're called, all of the above, will pay for digital is much lower. And the price that they pay for print is still very, very high. And in an interesting way, it's the difference between niche targeting and broad targeting. People sometimes used to say to me, why does it cost so much to advertise in Vogue? And the answer would come, because Chanel, you basically have 10,000 UK customers, of which 9,800 buy Vogue every single month. And although it's very expensive, it's actually incredibly targeted. It's zero wastage. With digital, where you get now these enormous audiences, the margin of profit is much, much lower because you're competing in a different market where you're up against social media, opinion formers of every kind, and there are many, many different ways. But I actually think that most of the Conde Nast titles, and I now look at them with the eyes of a reader and a user, I think that the growth of it is rather impressive. And I think that the standard of what they're doing is high in digital. And of course, there's things that can always be better, but I think they're faring better than most.
What an amazing story. I'm fascinated to know how it felt at the time when I talked to a lot of the guests on the podcast. I think there's a recurring theme, which is that the dots didn't join up when we looked forward. It was only looking back that we could see the dots joining up. And I think when you talk about that incredible growth, if I was sitting in a board meeting now with a company sort of saying, well, we're going to go from, whatever it was, 20 to hundreds of these titles, I'd be sitting there thinking, my gosh, less is more, we need more focus. How did you get yourself comfortable at the time that incredible explosion was going to be something that you could deliver on, manage? Was it something that you had planned from the beginning, or did it evolve?
I'm going to shock you slightly by saying that the Conde Nast board was the executive board, the international board that planned these things, had zero non-executive directors on it. There were none. Everything was rather instinctive and seat of the pants-ish. And as things worked well, they were replicated in other places. And the argument would slightly go like this. Russia has opened up. We need to be in Russia. All the luxury goods companies are in Russia, and they want Vogue to be there to advertise in. Therefore, we will open in Russia. It's in the Russian language, so you hire a Russian team. In Russia, we had, I think, at the height, 380 staff doing Vogue, Allure, the beauty magazine, Architectural Digest, a Russian edition of Tatler, the only other place in the world, I think, where there is another edition of Tatler, where the oligarchs, until they invaded Ukraine, read it endlessly. And the idea was to go into rather fearlessly into these markets, always owning everything ourselves if we possibly could. In one or two markets, you had to have a partner because that was the law and you couldn't go in without. But in India, we managed to go in wholly owned. In China, essentially wholly owned. In Russia, wholly owned. And it worked extremely well. I think if one was looking at it with the eyes that I now have, having been on different boards, I can see how unusual it is not to have all sorts of governance wonks and process experts and people making 11-year plans. But there really wasn't much of that. There was a great sense of energy. And I can tell you it was very thrilling to go into Russia and to find in no time at all there was 70 million in revenues with, I think, at its height, a 36% margin of profit. And furthermore, being able to take it out of Russia and it to be real profit. The company always spent all its costs against that year's profits. There was never any kind of 10-year amortization of costs over everything. So it felt like a very real, fast expanding business without much caution. There were financial people, of course, who were present at meetings, and somebody would usually say, do you think it's wise for us to open in Korea if we're opening at Japan at roughly the same time? The Newhouse family are very impatient. They literally didn't really like hearing that kind of thing. And actually, I don't really either. I much prefer a plan being made rather swiftly and not endlessly interrogated by people looking at it and cross-questioning it. I think if you have 5 or 6 people who you think know what they're doing, I think in a slightly piratical and cowboyish way, but they do have to know what they're doing. I mean, they do have to know what it's going to cost to put together a magazine and how many millions of pounds you're going to need to spend in marketing it and how many pages of advertising you would hope to get and at what price. The publishing industry only has 4 variables. It's unbelievably easy. It's how many copies you sell, how many ad pages you sell, at what price, and the cost of employment. And that's basically it. And if you get those things right, it can work incredibly well. With digital, it's a trickier one because on the face of it, it's going to be cheaper because you don't have print and paper. So the tens and hundreds of millions that were being spent every year on 100-gram glossy paper isn't there. But what quickly becomes apparent is there is never a moment when you're happy with your tech. There's never a moment when it isn't having to be upgraded. And the upgrade is always incredibly expensive. And the caliber of people working on it are different. I don't mean that they're worse. I definitely don't mean they're worse, but they have different skills. And they have, in a way, less loyalty to the brand. I give you an example. The staff of Vogue or Tatler or House and Garden or Interiors or Vanity Fair or any of these magazines were very reluctant to leave because it is a very glamorous world to be on and to be associated with, and and it gives you a sense of self for some people, and it's a very understandable thing. A lot of staff who came to work there in those days had slightly wanted to since they were about 13 and they had first read this magazine or that. Oh God, wouldn't it be so great to one day work on Vogue? And having got onto Vogue, they want to be on Vogue. When they were offered a job elsewhere, I would often get people coming to me to say, Nicholas, can I have a word with you? I just don't know what to do. I need your advice. I'm number 4, as you know, on Tackler, but I've been offered the job of number 3 on Marie Claire, and I'm going to be paid 5,000 a year more. I don't want to leave, but I really need the money. What should I do? And I would say, well, look, we don't want you to leave either, but I hope you've thought it through properly. That at the moment, when you go to any of these industry events, you're sitting on table 1 or table 2. Look forward to being on table 11, because that's where you'll be. And I said, your friendship group won't be reading it in the same way, and you may not feel you have quite as much identification with the brand. But in digital, obviously, this is not the case. People who have the digital skills that all of us need are much less loyal to the brand, and I suspect haven't been ever since they were 13, longing to work on GQ. They're very happy to work on GQ for a bit, and then if Google invites them at double the money, or someone else does, Tag Heuer watches, then they think, well, that's more money, I'll go. So it was an interesting time in that moment of transition. But as I said at the beginning, the main thrust of all the years I spent there were those great years of expansion. And very, very lucky we were too. Every industry goes through its period. And so it was.
The boom years. What an amazing story. And I love that insight around the difference in the nature of those tech employees versus your core product people, content people, and being more attached to the brand. And my sense would actually be that applies across industries. Generally, my experience of the technical people is they're fascinated by the technical problems, but they're somewhat content agnostic. And so it is a real challenge, I think, for boards generally to think about how do you build that employee value proposition for those critical technical people. You did also face, when you became chair of Conde Nast Britain, a period of difficult financial times when you were having to make cost savings and restructure things. I'm interested to hear how you worked as a sort of an executive board to navigate those sorts of decisions.
There was a time when more money clearly was going to need to be spent on digital. And it was just coming out of that period when the economy hit a difficult year. And there was some cutting back of the number of people on each title. Curiously, it wasn't that difficult to do in that rather classic way that if you've got 68 people on a project, you simply say, we'd like to now have 60, and 4 people are let go, generously let go. And the scene moved, and there was a very quick recovery. The economics of magazines is that the final 20% of advertising revenue makes an absolutely colossal difference because it becomes almost entirely profit after a certain point. And whereas up to a certain point, it's covering the costs of producing it. So it was, for that short period, relatively simple to do. Comparing it with, say, the V&A, if we think about how that was a very different situation. The first 5 years I'd been chair there, visitor numbers had just grown and grown and grown. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. And they were common across many of the museums. Although in the case of the Victoria and Albert Museum, I think the team there did a very good job of finding a succession of blockbuster shows, which then bring large numbers of people in who then discover the museum sometimes for the first time in a while. And then while they're there, they go to the cafes and they buy the William Morris oven gloves and they buy jewelry in the very marvelous V&A jewelry shop and all the rest. So there have been 5 very, very strong years. Then came COVID, and the museum had to close for the best part of a year. And as you know, and can easily guess, if you have, as the museum had, 1,100 staff, some of whom could be furloughed, but some of whom, of course, can't, because you can't leave it empty. And you have 0 visitors, and half of your income comes from visitor-generated cash, all of the national museums suddenly found themselves in a very tricky thing. And we had very enjoyable twice a week Zoom calls with the 6 directors and the 6 chairs. And of course, it was very, very interesting because you were looking into people's homes, which you never normally would see at all. And some of them, as you would exactly expect, given that it was the National Gallery and the BM and all the rest, people were in very magnificent rooms. And then one or two were sitting up in a child's bedroom with 2 bunks behind and the Superman duvet and all the rest of it. But we realized fairly quickly, clearly, that we needed to be saved by the Treasury. And it was a question of working out how much we as organizations could do ourselves, because I think it was not going to be right to just go along rattling the tin and saying we can't do nothing, but please give us everything. And in the end, I thought incredibly generously. I must have to say, Rishi Sunak, who was Chancellor then, it was marvellous, the outcome. Oliver Dowden was very helpful at that period too. The V&A, for example, was given 19 million as a non-returnable gift to save the day. And we agreed to save about 10 million a year for the next 3 years, which was done by reducing the number of staff, 100 left, or just over 100 actually, more like 120, of which all but 8 were voluntary. And 2 groups went. One were very senior keepers who had been there a very, very long time, who had been thinking of leaving for a few years. It's that classic thing where you say, I think this might well be my last year, I don't think, just be prepared. I doubt I'll do it. And then they do another year and then another year and another year, because it's a lovely place to work. But quite a lot of some senior members who had been at the museum for 30 years plus very generously agreed to leave. And then there were quite a lot of younger people who had spent a year at home with their parents during lockdown. They were perhaps age 30 and were number 14 out of a department of 18 and specialist in something. And I think they just reevaluated their lives and realized that they could get a job in a museum somewhere else in the country and no longer wanted to return to their Hackney Wick studio apartment and then travel into South Kensington every day. But the board were very supportive on it. And I think we didn't really have very much option. The thing that I cared about, and Tristram Hunt, the director, cared very much about, and actually everyone cared about, was that people, when they were leaving, should be very much thanked. People had done wonderful service to the museum. And so as soon as we could, we had lots of parties to say goodbye to people and proper speeches and proper presents and, all those things, which I think matter. Sometimes companies can be very careless when they have to make cuts and they become suddenly very hard-nosed and don't take care. But I very much think it's important for boards to do so.
2 questions on that. First is, I guess, often the reason that companies become hard-nosed in those situations is out of financial necessity, where they're really up against it, they're running out of liquidity. And so the choice is, do we imperil those remaining for the benefit of ensuring those leaving feel properly looked after? So curious to hear how you think about that as a first point. The second I'm really interested to hear how you thought about was this idea of voluntary versus involuntary redundancy, because that's always a key decision as a board. And one of the things that always worries me when I hear a board talking about voluntary redundancy is, are you going to lose all your best people who are the ones who can easily go and get other jobs? And then you get left with your bottom quartile people having shed your top quartile people. So really interested to hear how you thought about those 2 things.
As it happens, Those people who applied, by and large, there were exceptions to this, but by and large, were people who perhaps didn't see the next 20 years of their career being there for whatever reason. Either they wished to move out of London or they thought they would do better in something else or something. And I'm very relieved to say that the museum didn't lose its really crucial key people. In fact, I think we ended up pretty much intact on that. When I say about survival in a company is the most important thing of all. So, I mean, there's no lengths that you shouldn't go to if you're up against it to that great extent. With the V&A during the COVID lockdown, that was never the problem. The problem was to simply make sure that we were able to get back to where we were before as quickly as possible and not be weighed down with expense and cost that was going to just be too great to bear. And one of the reasons, by the way, that I think the Victoria and Albert Museum is pretty much back now. It's on about 90-something% of the very, very highest period before, is because of that. But to write a decent thank you letter to somebody takes how long? 3-side thank you letter. I reckon it takes 10 minutes. If you sit down and you're thoughtful about it and you know the person a bit and you have some understanding of what it is that they've been doing and you're able to, this sounds rather cold-hearted, but actually it's not. I think it does help, actually, rather than someone having to leave somewhere that they've loved and sort of slightly feeling that they're scuttling out and no one has noticed and no one cares. So I'm a great advocate wherever you can of doing that and making it, because after a bit, you don't want to create all sorts of people who speaking ill of where they were or feeling ill of where they were when they've done so many great things.
I love that. And actually, it reminds me a lot of, I remember listening to Indra Nair, the former CEO of PepsiCo, who used to write letters to the families of all her senior executive team, thanking them all that they were so supportive and had allowed her to have so much time of these incredibly talented executives. And she just said the impact of it was disproportionate to the time that it had the families bought into the journey as well as the execs. So that really resonates with what you're saying there.
I think that's a very, very clever thing to have done and a very kind and thoughtful thing to have done. I applaud it.
Now, you've touched on a number of examples already where you have delivered some amazing fundraising outcomes. And, earlier you said, Rishi Sunak was incredibly generous as Chancellor, but I suspect you have played a big role in that. And I'm curious to know, for someone, a chair who's listening to this right now, thinking, how on earth does he do it? How does he raise these sort of millions of pounds for these projects? Now, I've actually been in a room with you once. You probably won't remember this, but I know one of your superpowers because I remember seeing you. And by the time I got onto my second person in the room, you had been around every person in the room and made them all feel incredibly special. And you'd spoken to me as well. It made me feel $1 million. And then you were walking out of the room just as I was probably getting onto my third person. And so I can see that is clearly one superpower that you have of just being able to build incredible connections with people.
Well, let me answer, but I want to say something before. The money that's been raised by the V&A, there's a big, big team there. I mean, there's 30 people working in development, and I would hate anyone to be listening to this thinking it was me raising every penny, because it sure wasn't. I think the truth is that to be a chair these days of a national museum or gallery or many other institutions, actually, if you are completely averse to fundraising, which is not my favorite thing at all, it really is not, but I think that it goes with the territory, and you just have to do it. Development departments generally, of all kinds of organizations, I think on the whole can get things to a certain point and they can tee people up, and they're very, very good at identifying who might be susceptible to helping. But in the end, if you are a millionaire and you are about to give or you're considering giving £2 million to redo a gallery at the Victoria and Albert Museum, or frankly, to build a new tennis court. All of these matters. There is a moment when the director and the chair, or in Eton's case, the headmaster and the provost and vice provost and others. Someone has to be there kind of tipping people over the edge, or at least trying to. And so it is with historic royal palaces. I can see I've been there a month, and there's a very good fundraising department there, like there was at the V&A. But I can see already that the final nudge has to come. I had a terrifying fundraising experience over the late Queen's Platinum Jubilee, because I was asked if I would like to be co-chair of the pageant, which is the big event on the final day. And I heard myself saying that I would, because it would be dull not to, wouldn't it? And so I was pleased to be asked. And so I go to the first meeting, and I suddenly realize that my co-chair wanted to do other parts of what needed doing as well, but felt that he didn't want to get involved at all in the fundraising. And he said, well, could I oversee that with the little team? And I said, well, how much have we got to raise? And he said, well, about 15 million. And I said, how long have we got? And he said, 5 months. And I came back, I felt absolutely, I think, freaked out and very, very panicked, because I knew that if we didn't get to it, and it's an awful lot of money, it really is, in that length of time. And I thought that I could hear myself having to apologise if we didn't get it. And there would be, as it were, the Chancellor of the Exchequer and probably the Keeper of the Privy Purse sitting there too. And I'll be saying, well, we've done quite well. We haven't quite got to 15. Yeah, we got 2,131,040 or something, and will you make up the difference? And they would all look tremendously disappointed and furious. So we scraped it. And there were some very kind people who did it. But I think it's completely part and parcel of it. And in a broader board way, when you're thinking about how should boards face up to fundraising, in my experience, half the board normally see helping the fundraising efforts as something that they should do, and they try to think of people who might be able to help, and they play a part in it. And then the other half sort of see their role as being thinking of reasons why you shouldn't accept the money, under enormous amounts of due diligence and process and all the rest of it. And if they can possibly find a reason to not take it, they feel that's a good day's work. But it's a difficult time to fundraise, and I think it's going to get more difficult. I think the priorities of people who give money are slightly changing. We've come through a period where galleries and museums, etc., slightly less appealing as the great Sainsbury foundations and others come to the end of that period. I think a lot of the new tech billionaires want to give to climate change or eradicating polio or other good things. And why should they not? These are very good things for them to be doing. So it's one of the most important things is trying to find all the time new people who want to give back.
You've recently become chair of Historic Royal Palaces, and I think earlier this year the University of Manchester partnered with them to conduct research on the British monarchy's link to slavery. And I think the study has full access to the Royal Archives and the Royal Collection. The partnership was initiated before your time, but I'm really curious to hear how you think it might add value to historic royal palaces. And curious also to understand how you think, or to what extent you think, boards have a responsibility to hold organisations accountable for their distant history, which seems to be a recurring theme recently. Boards are facing more and more challenges about how to respond to their history.
Let me answer it. It was indeed commissioned before my time. Historic Royal Palaces has a big research function. It commissions every year lots of pieces of research, and it's been doing quite a lot of work with Manchester University, who are doing a number of different reports at the moment. One of them is this one. It isn't quite called the way you described it, but when it was written up in the papers, they very sensibly, because I would have done exactly the same thing if I was a newspaper journalist and I was writing about it, they made it seem slightly more emotive than the piece of research really is. And it goes right back into that period when the brother of King Charles II was a shareholder at one point in the Africa Company, as were so many. And there will be a paper which will then go for approval as a PhD. And I think in due course, it will just be added to the great amount of material there is on that subject. The whole question of restitution and all the rest of it is, as we know, incredibly live. At the V&A, there were 2,800,000 pieces in the collection, of which about 1 million come from overseas. Only, I think it's 3 or 4 are disputed. Museums at the moment have a right to loan pieces back. And I'll tell you a story which actually gives you a very interesting insight on it. One of the pieces the Victoria and Albert Museum has is the Crown of Ethiopia. It's from the Crown Jewels of Ethiopia. It goes back to the Battle of Magdala in whenever it was, 1851, I think, around there. After the Emperor of Abyssinia had kidnapped a number of European and British people, and an expeditionary force was sent with guns, and it knocked down the walls of Magdala, which was his capital. And I'm afraid the British troops rather ran amok, having walked across the entirety of Ethiopia. I think they became quite ill-disciplined, and they stole a lot of stuff. They put it in their rucksacks. On the ship back to England, their officers removed it from them, saying they had no business to have taken it. And it was given to the government over here. And some of it's in the British Library, and some is in National Museum in Greenwich, and some is in the V&A, including the Crown. The museum has a plan to loan it back to Addis Ababa. The Ethiopians wanted it. There were various conditions, like it had to be in a bulletproof case and various other things. And there was a plan that it would go back for 25 years and then come back to England for 10 and then go for 25 and 10. Then everything went wrong. 3 things happened all at once. The family of the emperor wrote in and said it doesn't belong to Ethiopia, it belongs to us personally. And we would like it, please, if you have any plans to loan it or give it. Then the Coptic Church wrote in and said it had been stolen from their church by the Emperor of Abyssinia, and it belongs to them, not to either of the other 2 parties. And then there was the Tigrayan uprising, and the Tigrayan mercenaries were marching on Addis Ababa. And it seemed a very, very bad time to be flying this priceless crown jewel in, where, of course, there would have been an almost certainty that had they taken Addis Ababa, which they didn't, it would have been immediately melted down, and that would have been the end of that. So it's now on full show in South Kensington and absolutely well worth seeing. Most of the pieces in most of the museums, when you look at the provenance of them, they were bought in Christie's, they were bought in Sotheby's, they were bought from dealers in Rome or in Florence. And during the Grand Tour, the museums still receive maybe 10,000 pieces a year that are bequeathed to them, and amazing things come. It's a very, very hard subject. One of the arguments people say now is, but you can make replicas of the Elgin marbles or any great pieces. And so people could look at them instead. And I think by the same token, whenever I go to New York and I'm in the Met or I'm in the Smithsonian in Washington, and I see those gallery after gallery of amazing British paintings and the Chippendale that they've got and the incredible Turners and the Constables and the Stubbses, do I think they should, do we want a world where museums only are national museums of their own? So the V&A would end up as enormous displays of William Morris. Should the South American museums return all the incredible Spanish artwork that's there? It's a tricky thing. At the V&A, as far as the labels are concerned, and I know that historic royal palaces come to it in exactly the same way, nothing is hushed up, but it's not the main thing. If you saw a beautiful sculpture, it will tell you who made it, where it came from, what the materials are, and give you something of the history of who's owned it before it came to the museum. And you normally have 4 paragraphs that you can write. I think if one was doing it in the wrong way, it would start off by saying, once the property of notorious slave driver so-and-so, whose family had a 0.5% investment in a plantation in St. Lucia, Canova's Three Graces is made of marble and blah, blah, blah. 1 or 2 museums have slightly gone down that track. I think Tristram Hunt and the Director of Collections and others have been very good about getting the balance right. So nothing is hidden, but there tries to be a proper sense of priority, of provenance versus beauty versus most of these pieces have very, very long histories.
Interesting. So if I reflect back, would it be fair to say that you see the role of the board to ensure things are transparent, but not to unwind the complexities of the past?
That is my view. I think that research into history and fully understanding the stories behind the pieces in the collection.
So, Nicholas, time's flown by, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to say a short statement and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Okay.
So first up, the boardroom behaviour that irritates you most.
People who don't say what they think during the board meeting, but afterwards.
Love it. The best book every board member should read, and why?
I've never read one of those business books. I was given one that used to be everywhere called Someone Has Stolen My Cheese or something. And whenever you went into Terminal 5, which I did very, very often at one point, there was always a big display of who's nicked my cheese or who's stolen my cheese. And I read the first 3 pages of it and I felt very, very depressed, since it all seemed very theoretical and I couldn't imagine it connecting to anything that I've ever been involved with. So I'm not a great business book reader, so I'm the wrong person to ask.
Excellent. Favourite quote and why?
Well, I think a business quote that's good is that you should always think like the customer, or spend at least part of your time thinking like the customer. One is invited to think from many different viewpoints these days. You know, you're thinking from another word I can't bear, stakeholder. And people say, well, the stakeholders, and what do they think? And then you're thinking about what might the government think, and what might this person or that person think, or what might diversity and inclusion people think on this subject. Actually, I think that if it's a magazine, you should be thinking, what does the reader want? And you should be trying to, and that's why editors are never going to be replaced by Chat GPT, because it's a sort of it's an instinct of what the reader might want to read.
What has been your most significant professional insight?
The importance of turning up, and the importance of turning up to actual things. You made a kind of kind joke at the beginning about me at a party and wandering around talking to people. I have an absolute pet hate that in the museum world, and it doesn't happen very often, but in heritage world, sometimes you see the development department at a party and they're all talking to one another. Well, what on earth is the point of that? Talking to someone at the next door desk. I think that if you are involved in one of these organizations, the point of a gathering is that you're getting feedback and wandering around, and people frequently, I find, tell you things that you're so getting out there. I'm very against working from home. I wish it had never been invented as a thing. It amazes me the number of people who are. I was on a thing the other day, and there was a person who works for the civil service, and up in Scotland, in the course of this discussion, he announced to us all that the world had now completely changed and everyone worked from home now, and that as a consequence, nobody went more than 5 miles from their house, and everyone worked from home. And I just couldn't resist saying, I just actually couldn't bear hearing him say this. I said, do you know, I don't think I know a single person who works from home, actually. I said they might occasionally if they have flu, or they might one day a week if they drive somewhere. But I said, by and large, I think you need to be in your office, in your boardroom, walking around the museum, walking around historic royal palaces. If you're in a school, you should be walking around the streets and speaking to people and meeting people. So I'm a huge enemy of WFH.
The worst professional advice you've ever received?
The worst professional advice I've ever had was from a careers master who, in a conversation I had, only talked about joining big corporations and money and things like that. And the absolutely most essential thing in life is that you must find things that you like doing and do them. I think in the end, it's the only advice that matters. My late father, actually, who was a bit of a city tycoon in his day, I remember him saying to his 3 sons in the car, he said, he didn't normally give any advice, but he said, just so that you know, I really don't think you should go and do anything like work in the city or in finance or anything unless you really, really want to. And for the avoidance of doubt, I don't mind what you do. He said, the only thing you've got to do when you leave university is you've got to have a job, any job, and you have to go to it 5 days a week, and you have to be paid on Friday, and you can just do whatever you like in your life because you're much more likely to have a nice life. And so I think that's the advice that I would give, and the reverse of that is the advice that I would avoid. And I think I always have done that because I've worked in journalism, which I've absolutely loved, and museums, which has turned out to be tremendously enjoyable, and heritage. And let's see whether the next chapter is as fun. I think it might be.
I love that. Gosh, so Nicholas, this has been an absolute treat. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your incredible range of experiences and your incredible passion for what you do.
Well, thank you very much. It was very fun.
And thanks to all of you listening. We've been blown away by the incredible feedback about how this podcast has been helping you get board roles and become better board members. This podcast is for you, so if you'd like to suggest guests, topics, difficult challenges, or you'd like to share stories about how the podcast has impacted you, or have suggestions on how we can improve, please email podcast@newroll.com. That's podcast@newroll.com, and let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, thanks again for listening and look forward to having you back here for the next discussion.